Well, good afternoon, everybody, to our gathering this evening by webinar for this special occasion of the launch of the Mercy Law Resource Centre's annual report, focusing on 2020. As chair of Mercy Law Resource Centre, I extend a really warm welcome to all of you who have joined us here this afternoon. And I thank you for taking the time and coming to be with us. I'm especially thinking of all of our friends and supporters, former staff, former directors who've joined us. I'm thinking of our volunteers, interns, befrienders who have worked with us. I'm thinking of our funders and our donors who make our service possible. Particularly, I'm thinking of the Archdiocese, Mason Hazen Kern, A&L Goodbody, Sisters of Mercy, and many others, upon whose commitment and whose support for us over the years has been absolutely vital. I'm thinking too of our pro bono contributors, particularly our auditor, Crowley's DFK, who have all over the years have provided us with the auditing services that we require, totally pro bono. And to the many barristers who engage with us whenever we are involved in court work, and our appreciation and thanks go to all of them. And thank you for all of you who've been able to be with us. Also, I'm conscious of the many representatives of other organisations who are working in the field of homelessness who've joined us this afternoon and with whom we interrelate and engage on many ways and on many projects that are common to us all. And I thank as well and welcome representatives of Sophia Housing, who are our landlord, but also our supporter here in Cork Street. So thank you to you all for being with us. And I extend a very special warm welcome to our special guest this afternoon, Noeline Blackwell. Noeline is here with us to formally launch the report for this year, but Noeline is well known to many of us as a voice for public advocacy for those who are in particular stress and strain. And so, Noeline, we look forward to hearing your words to us this afternoon. Our report, which I just show you on screen now, if you can see it, it is hot off the press for 2020. But our report, our annual report, is our opportunity to be accountable, not only to the civil authorities, which are very particular, but also to you, our friends and donors and supporters, but above all to our clients, the people who rely on our efforts to enable them to untangle their difficulties and vindicate their rights. And we'll hear more detail about the report from Aoife, our managing solicitor, in a moment. And today, in this date of the 30th of November 2021, the context for our report is still deeply troubling, with almost 9,000 people in emergency accommodation this month. Ongoing emergency, a word that is part of the company with its real meaning, because so very many people are in this kind of accommodation for often longer than a year. So emergency is a misnomer. It's not insecure or short-term or inadequate accommodation we're talking about, but absolute emergency. And that 9,000 includes some 2,500 children. And it doesn't count the people who decide to not even be able to access this emergency accommodation, or use the doorways in the streets, or use under the bridges, or sofa surf. In spite of all of what has gone on, particularly over the last 2 years, Mercy Law has found itself extremely busy and working full time, even in the lockdown year of 2020. Last week, I saw a news item on Euronews TV channel. It made a big deal of a group of Italian lawyers getting together to establish a free legal service for people affected by homelessness. It sounded very like Mercy Law to me. New in Italy, but in its 12th year here. So this afternoon, I hope that you enjoy this occasion, that you're encouraged by it, and that you find yourself topped up energy for making good on the cry for a home that is in our midst. Making peace, making healing, making justice, and making a new world where nobody is excluded and everybody can find a place in this world we live in. So I'm very happy to hand you over now for further detail, for an exploring of our report today, to our managing solicitor, Aoife Kelly-Desmond. So welcome, Aoife, and I hand over to you.
Thank you, Helena, and thanks everyone for coming to join us today. So as Helena has mentioned, Noeline Blackwell is here today to formally launch our report, which we're very grateful for, and I will properly introduce and hand over to Noeline shortly. But before I do that, I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about what's in this report. And as with any annual report, really this is about reflecting back on 2020 and not only on our work during the year, but this was also on the challenges and on the victories, for want of a better term. And you know, looking back at 2020 for us in Mercy Law, and I'm sure for many others, it can feel like you're looking back at nothing but challenges, but there are some good things there as well. And you know, for us in particular, where we may have been able to have good outcomes for clients to get out of a situation of housing crisis, those are things that it's important to celebrate. And so it's a consistent theme in the report, and when I'm going through it today, is that we've really tried to focus on the experiences of our clients and to draw out the challenges that they faced, but also to celebrate where they have had successes and been able to move on with their lives and away from the burden of homelessness. I'm sure that everybody who's coming here today is somewhat familiar with Mercy Law to be joining this launch. But it's just worth mentioning what our core services are, and that's how the report is structured. The centre of what we do is providing legal advice and representation to people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness on social housing and related social welfare law, but we do that around 5 key services. The first very much is the direct client advice and representation. As an independent law centre, providing that free legal advice and representation is the centre of what we do. We also provide support to organisations that work with people who may be impacted by homelessness, such as other homeless, direct outreach organisations, domestic violence services, addiction services, and so on. We provide training on housing law and related matters to organisations and also to individuals to help increase awareness and knowledge around housing law and rights. And we work in a policy side to advocate for changes to laws and practices that negatively affect our clients. And then lastly, we provide a befriending service to clients who are in particular need of support while dealing with their housing situation. I'm going to touch on each of those areas as I talk through some of the highlights of the report, but as I've already mentioned, at the heart of what we do here are our clients, and I'm going to speak mainly around the experiences of those clients as they've reflected on what really happens in the real life for people facing homelessness in Ireland in 2020. And I suppose, unfortunately, still today in 2021, the situation is not very much different for people who are caught in the housing crisis. I suppose when we look back at 2020, as I've already said, it was challenging for everybody, but it was definitely a particular challenge for people who were experiencing housing distress. And from our casework, we've seen again and again how the weight of the pandemic really fell the most heavily on those who didn't have the security of a home. And when you look at 2020 and at the housing statistics, at some points it might look like things improved slightly, and there were reductions in the overall numbers of homelessness at points during the year, partly no doubt due to measures like the freeze on evictions because of the pandemic. But overall, the numbers still remained very, very high. And Helena's already mentioned this today. You know, the numbers of people in homelessness are still well over 8,000, still very significant. And you know, when we look at those numbers, it's sometimes easy to get overwhelmed by them, and just it almost becomes such a large thing. It's hard to even really imagine the reality behind it. And you know, recognizing that there's an individual person behind every one of those 8,000 people, and there's individual families and children, people with their own lives, their own dreams, their own hopes and fears, is really important in our view for tackling homelessness, to really recognize the humanity of each person in that situation. When we look back at 2020, there's obviously a pretty seismic change that happened around March 2020. And for us, the number of calls that our service experienced between February and March 2020 reduced by almost 80% when pandemic restrictions kicked in. And that was most certainly not a reflection of a lack of need, but I think more a reflection of the disruption and uncertainty of the time. For us, we've always relied very heavily on face-to-face connections with our clients, and particularly we would have always held outreach clinics in accessible locations for people to access, like homeless hostels, cafes and places like that. So moving away from that was a complete upending of our service, but I'm very proud of the team to say that they were able to continue the service uninterrupted in 2020 and very rapidly moved to phone, video consultation and email to make sure that there was no point at which Mercy Law wasn't able to meet the needs of clients who urgently required it. And as the year progressed, we did see the volumes of people looking for help from our service increase again from April and creep back up over the year, never to quite the same high as it had been before the pandemic, for various reasons, but certainly overall in the year there was a very huge need of often very complex and entrenched cases. I mean, when you look back at it, you can really see, and I say this still holds true now, that COVID really brought the structural vulnerabilities that exist in our social housing and social welfare systems into really sharp relief. And many of the issues our clients came to us with in 2020 were not different issues than they'd had in previous years, but they were perhaps more urgent, more pressing and more desperate because of the surrounding context. And particularly when we look at our client groups, people who had other challenges as well as homelessness, like underlying health conditions, people with fleeing a domestic abuse situation, dealing with mental illness, addiction, people who are members of minority groups that experience discrimination, all of these other challenges compounded. And when you added on the restriction and reduction in capacity and supports that would traditionally help people in these situations, like domestic violence refuges, reducing capacity, just to give one example. And when you look at the just general fracturing of social supports that happened during the lockdowns, you can really see how the weight of all of those things compounded, that when then added into a homeless situation, just put so much weight on the shoulders of people who were already really struggling. And this is something that why we worked very hard in 2020 to keep meeting that need and keep helping the people who were coming to us in truly desperate situations. And I think I've probably talked enough in the general at this point. And I mean, I think one client who we've quoted in the report said to us that COVID made being homeless immensely worse. And when you stop and think about that and how desperate being homeless can already make people feel, it's really quite a profound thing to think about. Probably what really brings it more to life is to get into maybe some of the individual situations people have faced. So there's a number of case studies in the report. Some of them are directly in clients' own words about their own situations, and then some of them are just recounting the situations that came up. I might talk about two of them in particular that I think, for me, you know, reflecting back on the work of 2020, and this was, you know, I joined Mercy Law in 2021, so to an extent I'm reflecting back on this from the outside. And when I read these case studies and read into these case files, these two really stood out to me as showing how much these extra issues combined with the pandemic and other challenges and homelessness to just create such difficult situations that really, without legal support and advice, you could never hope for somebody to untangle by themselves. Maybe the first case I might talk about relates to a number of families who were trying to move to Ireland during the pandemic. Some of them were moving here, some of them had already lived here and were returning. And these families were EU citizens, but they were all members of the Roma community, which is a group that, in our experience, faces really serious barriers and discrimination when trying to access housing in Ireland, both in terms of private rental housing and also housing supports. And in this situation, these families came to Ireland, and because it was during lockdown scenario, they had to quarantine in a HSC isolation facility for a period of time. And when they were coming out of that facility, they then sought access to emergency accommodation so that they would have somewhere to live while they became established. This requires a local authority to conduct an assessment to determine, is this person actually homeless? These families were absolutely and unquestionably homeless, both in the sense everyone would understand it and also in the legal sense under legislation. But they were still being refused, and for various different reasons. Some were being given no reasons, no one was answering them. Some were being given reasons that were actually not legally correct or were not even related to being homeless. And it was very difficult to even understand why these people were being refused access to accommodation at such a desperate time. And the result of this was that for these families, some of them, when they were coming out of this accommodation, had no choice but to end up rough sleeping with children, with young families in, you know, very, very desperate situations at a time when people were being told to self-isolate, to take care of hygiene measures, to homeschool children. And we intervened in those cases directly with the local authorities to try to get clarity on what legal approach the authorities believed they were taking, and to explain to them what legal approach they should be taking. This required a lot of very strong and repeated advocacy by Mercy Law, and ultimately in a number of cases we had to threaten to take legal proceedings against the local authorities, and eventually they did relent and allow these people access to accommodation. And in those individual cases, we were obviously very happy to have a success, and those were one of the successes that we celebrate. But ultimately, the underlying causes of why that was happening are issues that we still see now in our casework, and are part of the structural issues that continue to affect people coming into the country who maybe are coming from a minority background or coming in a difficult situation and don't automatically get their entitlements that they should be getting. The other case that I want to touch on, I suppose, deals with an issue that, you know, a lot of organisations have commented on seeing over the course of 2020, and that's around how the COVID restrictions and the pandemic impacted people who were coming from a scenario of domestic abuse. And we certainly saw quite a number of referrals from people leaving domestic abuse situations. And there's a number of legal barriers that somebody who's trying to leave a domestic abuse situation may face when trying to access housing, and they're barriers that they shouldn't face. And there's a lot of, there's guidelines and things around this, how local authorities should deal with people who come to them when they're looking for shelter. But how that's always applied in practice can be difficult, and there's certainly a lot of reliance on refuges to give people a place to be in the interim period. But if a refuge isn't accessible, and someone can't return to their own home and they can't afford their own accommodation, well, then a local authority should step in and provide emergency accommodation for that person while they get established. One very egregious case that we dealt with in 2020 concerned a family who were leaving a very severe situation of domestic violence, but because of particular circumstances for that family, they weren't able to access refuge accommodation. And in 2020, that was a challenge for many because space was reduced due to COVID issues. This family presented to the local authority seeking accommodation while they established themselves, and they were refused for a litany of different reasons, none of them legally valid, including the really quite alarming reason that the accommodation the local authority had to provide wasn't considered safe for them in their circumstances. The result was the family had to sleep in their car outside a guard station for a number of days. We intervened and took legal proceedings against the local authority, and after proceedings were issued, the local authority relented and provided accommodation. So again, for that family, they were able to get secure and safe housing, which was hugely important for them. But ultimately, the underlying issues that are there about how that happens are something that we still in our policy and advocacy work to date continue to look at. And, I suppose maybe carrying on from that, when you listen to these experiences and these situations, it can be very frustrating, and it's easy to get quite frustrated at the scenarios people can end up in where their legal rights are not being are not being respected without the legal intervention of an organisation like Mercy Law. And for that reason, while we're always very, very happy to achieve good results for individual clients, and that's, you know, a huge amount of our energy goes into, ultimately, you know, achieving overall changes in laws and practices that negatively impact our clients is absolutely fundamental to really making a profound impact into the future. So for that reason, our policy work is, you know, another really important part of what we do. So I might then just move on to talk a little bit about our policy work in 2020. As will probably come across from what I've already said, we draw our policy work from our casework and from the issues that we see coming up for our clients. That's where we then focus our attentions in our policy and advocacy, looking at what could change to help the situation not happen again for another family or another person. And in 2020, we focused very heavily on one issue in our policy work, which is the right to a home. And all of our clients have complex individual situations. They all have different scenarios, different individual needs, and the particular legal issue that's coming up for them may be quite distinct or complex. But if you really take a step back from different pieces of legislation and regulations and so on, ultimately all of our clients have the same need, which is they need a safe and secure home. And without that, they can't move on with their lives. They can't get out of the situation they're in. So for that reason, to us, the right to a home has long been a focus of Mercy Law's policy work. And as kicking off in 2020 in January, we joined a number of other stakeholders in the area to launch Home for Good, which is a coalition that are looking at constitutional change in the area of housing and who see constitutional change as being very important to really underpin any successful programme around tackling housing and homelessness. And that continues to be a policy focus for Mercy Law, and throughout 2020 we would have met with a number of politicians about the issue of looking at the constitution and constitutional change. And a real highlight for us in 2020 was toward the end of the year when Rebecca Keating, who was my predecessor as managing solicitor, presented the proposed wording for a constitutional amendment around a right to housing in the constitution to the Joint Oireachtas Committee. As we sit here now towards the end of 2021, following the government's publication of Housing for All, there should be shortly established a commission for housing which is going to look at the issue of a referendum. So it's hopeful that there will be some progress in this area, and perhaps next year that there may be real progress towards moving towards a real recognition of a right to housing in the Constitution. Aside from that, it wasn't the only thing we did. I won't go through every line of the report, but there was other policy work that we also did as part of our long-running focus on children and families in homelessness, as well as other issues around that. I might just touch briefly then on training and support to other training and legal support. I mentioned that at the start that two of our other core services are providing support to organisations and also providing training on housing law. And the reason that's so important to us is that, you know, as we've said, many of our clients do face other issues. They face issues such as domestic abuse, dealing with addiction, mental illness, leaving prison, other challenges like that. So organisations that work directly with people facing those kinds of issues will often come across housing issues when a particular client is due to leave a refuge or something of that nature. And for us to be able to help those organisations, if they come across a legal issue, hugely increases the reach of people who can have their housing rights asserted for them if they need help. So we did a lot of work in 2020 around assisting other organisations. I think we dealt with, over 50 organisations that we would have given direct legal support to when they had issues come up for their clients around accessing housing. And we also gave training to a large number of organisations on these areas, and that's something we continue to do. We give our housing law training, and also our director, Professor Jerry White, also delivers a very popular social welfare law course to a very large group of people as well. The last thing I might talk about in the report is just around our befriending service. Befriending has been a part of Mercy Law since the start, and you know, when people are dealing with housing challenges and legal issues around housing, it's often an extremely stressful process to deal with, and even when the legal issue might be resolved, you know, they may still have challenges in settling into resolving their housing situation fully. So linking up somebody, a befriender who can support someone with the other aspects of dealing with their situation and can provide that emotional support and also some practical support is hugely valuable. Now, as with everything else, that was seriously disrupted in 2020 because befriending is such a personal service that it really traditionally operates face-to-face. But we were glad to have some befriending activities be able to continue through 2020, and we're very grateful to the befrienders who were able to carry on that work for us during 2020. Again, sadly, coming to the end of 2021, we're still in a similar situation with our befriending, but we are hoping to increase our activities in that area very much again next year, because it's something that I think for both the befrienders and the befriendees is always so valuable. Just before I finish up, I might say a few thank yous. Now, Helena has also already very gratefully thanked all of our various supporters and the people who assist us, so I won't repeat this too much, but just to say, I suppose as a general comment, for me, when I joined Mercy Law earlier this year, I was familiar with the organisation for some time, but I was really blown away by just how much goodwill and support there really is for Mercy Law, and how many people contact us looking to volunteer and to help and assist us, and who give us so much pro bono support. And it's just absolutely vital for us to be able to continue operating and to increase and have as much impact as we need. But it's also very encouraging for us working in Mercy Law that there are so many people who want to help and help our clients and help the cause that we do. So I'd just say a general thank you to everybody who's contributed to Mercy Law in any way in 2020 or otherwise, whether it's volunteers, people who give pro bono services, people who donate, or people who just spread the word about us and make people aware of us so that people who need us can find us. I might stop now and hand you over to Noeline for the formal launch. So I think most people here will probably be well familiar with Noeline, but just to give a very brief introduction, Noeline Blackwell is the CEO of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Noeline is a human rights lawyer and was previously the Director General of the Access to Justice organisation, FLAC, for I believe over 10 years. So Noeline has a lot of experience, familiarity with the type of legal work that we do as well. So we're really grateful to have Noeline here today launching this report, and I will now stop talking and hand you over to her. So thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Aoife. And you don't have to be grateful at all. It's a great pleasure and a great honour to be asked to launch the 2020 Mercy Law Resource Centre annual report. I've been a fan of the organisation since the outset of it. But every time I hear about what the centre is doing, I think, in fact, it is going deeper and stronger and creating more evidence, more understanding, and more recognition of the rights of a group who simply wouldn't get that kind of attention, or the individuals within a group who wouldn't get that attention without what you are doing. I wish you well, Aoife. I know you came in at the beginning of 2021, and I wish you well. I do think it's a big job, but as Helena was saying in the chat before we started it all, it's really nice at a time where life can be very frustrating to be doing something that, you know, makes a difference, or to be doing something, is what some of my staff might sometimes say to me, but at least to be having a go at trying to make things that bit better. And undoubtedly 2020 was the year when every annual report had to talk about COVID. And I was struck by what you said there, Aoife, that COVID brought the cracks into greater relief in services, in structures, in systems, absolutely. And where you were without a house and a home, and where it seemed impossible for anyone to do anything other than to retreat into their current accommodation, because that's what we were all asked to do. We're all asked not to move, not to go anywhere, not to change from where we were, which was an issue for us in the Rape Crisis Centre as well, because again, we were so conscious that in those circumstances, some people were being asked to remain, to stay in circumstances, as you both said, of domestic violence, of difficulty, of places where their current space was not safe for them. And still nobody had a better idea about what you do, with some small reliefs, which I mentioned in your report as well, like for instance, the ban on eviction probably being helpful. But just the idea that in a time where nobody knew where a pandemic style disease was coming at you from you knew not where, from where you were sleeping, from the air. We worked out it was the air eventually, or at least we've worked it out thus far that it was the air. Where you did have no access to medical services, where loads of services were closed down or shut back or pulled back. In those circumstances, to be without secure, safe housing meant you really were a person who was living in what you could only call a fearful situation. And so it is a great credit to every single person associated with Mercy Law Resource Centre that you kept your service open and that you kept it going. And you speak about some of the cases, and they're very telling. And yet again, the individual case tells whole stories. But just looking at some of your statistics there, you know, over the course of that year, to take over 2,500 phone calls, to undertake 1,660 different pieces of work with a tiny team, and with volunteers having to operate differently and pro bono lawyers having to operate differently, to give free legal advice to just short of 750 individuals and families, 749. I know when you're writing an annual report, it's the most frustrating thing when you can't find that two to go to 751, but 749 individuals and families, and over 50 organizations, as you mentioned there, to help them work it out. That was a true public service, a frontline service in its own way, dealing with some undoubtedly of the most vulnerable in our situation. And the Mercy Law Resource Centre vision of a society where every individual lives in dignity and enjoys equal rights, and in particular the right to a home, which is fundamental to every human being, where everyone is entitled to equal access to justice and legal recourse in order to vindicate those rights. Working with people in 2020 and every year, advocating for them, listening to them, recognizing their rights, and then insisting with others that they be observed as well. And then leading the rest of us on as well to understand the importance of those rights with education, with awareness raising, and building up the evidence. All of that has to be seen as a public service of the utmost good. And it's so great to be, again, coming back to that issue about access to justice as an issue of equality. In a society where everyone is not equal, that right of at least equal access to services is one that is really distressing when it's not observed. And in so many cases, in so many of the cases that come up in this report and come up from Mercy Law Resource Centre, that's just not the case. You don't have the same access. You mentioned at the end, Aoife, the befriending service. That I always thought was the most unique thing about Mercy Law Resource Centre, going back to Michelle O'Kelly when she had that idea back in the day for the befriending service, because it is, I suppose, about that buddy system as well, but it's how all of us were paralysed to a certain extent during COVID. All of us were afraid. We were afraid to go to the shop. We were afraid to go to school. We were afraid in so many ways. And that was only, this is only an instant in time for an awful lot of us. But certainly we know in the Rape Crisis Centre as well, where a lot of our work is mental health services, we know that the anxiety of people who already had the trauma of sexual violence is exacerbated enormously by COVID. But we also know that the general population itself suffered a lot through the anxiety of COVID and the rest of it. Now, if we put ourselves vaguely in the position of someone who does not have access to secure housing or any housing, then the service of befriending, the service of giving people access to systems is greater than ever. It's just to recognize that our heads, you can't do everything. And if your head is so stressed with trying to make sure you know where you're sleeping that night or in the following week, or where your kids are going to be able to go when they're finished school or whatever, in those circumstances, it is absolutely not fair and not possible for people to be thinking clearly about every other aspect of their lives as well. So having a befriending service, as well as a service that recognizes that you have rights, that recognizes them, and then says, okay, if you don't have the language or the time or the space right now to advocate for you, we will help you. That is huge. And what that gives, in my mind, is dignity to people, dignity for every single person, and dignity in particular for those who have the added impact of the vulnerability of homelessness or incipient homelessness. And just, you know, I was kind of just depressed again when I saw the case of the man who had come out of prison and who had to go to some particular rounds to explain to a state authority that his daughter was his daughter, really, is what it comes down to. It's a longer story than that, but all he wanted to do was provide accommodation for his daughter as well as himself, if I understood it correctly. And he says, I used to be of the view that the system was broken. However, I now believe it is purposefully designed this way, with the hope and expectation that failure of applicants will negate my local council from their obligations. I'm depressed. I'm depressed that anyone in this country, where we consider ourselves a democratic country, where we strive for equality to a greater or lesser extent, where we believe that the rule of law applies, that somebody would get to a stage that that's what they actually see. They see the establishment, they see the legal system as out to do them down. And it's why I'm particularly proud to be here and to be associated today with an organization that uses law to advance justice. And you know, there's something about access to justice. You can't do it for everybody, but you do it directly. I also liked the other case, I think it's even on the same page, but I did read more than one page of the report, but the case of Sinead, who Sinead's father had died and they took her off the housing list, although she'd no home to call her own. And again, when you put it that way, you kind of go, how bizarre is that? Well, it was that bizarre, and you sorted it out. But I particularly like the bit where she says at one stage, Sinead says the difference that MLRC made was, so then we headed off to the High Court. And I think of all the days when you'd stand for hours and days in front of a photocopier and getting your pages mixed up, as Boris Johnson did in the UK, but you couldn't say forgive me because no judge would forgive you, and you had to do 3 copies or 5 copies of everything. It's not a case of just heading off to the High Court, but sometimes you have to head off to the High Court, and that she felt that she and the centre were heading off to the High Court together is a great sign of somebody actually having their rights vindicated by the legal system through your work, empowering her. She now could get on with her life. She was a capable woman anyway, but as Tom O'Malley, now FC, but a lecturer in NUI Galway, put it in a report around victims of sexual offences recently, I think it applies to quite a lot of people. Some people, you know, we talk about vulnerability in law as someone who's underage or someone who has a physical or a disability or an intellectual disability or a mental illness of some kind. But in fact, vulnerability can be because of the circumstances you find yourself in. And when I look at some of these cases that you report in this report, they are people who are capable, who actually have come through an awful lot more than most of us, but they find themselves in a position of particular difficulty, and where in fact the law is not just, or the implementation of the law, because it's so often the bureaucrat and the piece of paper or the person who just doesn't understand the rights framework in which they're operating. But the person who comes in looking for attention, looking for assistance, doesn't know that. They don't know that this is pettifogging and that it is quite wrong. But it is like all of the independent law centres, which have all been set up on a not-for-profit basis in order to make positive change and to use the law to advance human rights. Mercy Law Resource Centre is doing that through the individual cases, through then the teaching, the awareness raising. And you know, I look at some of the great work you're doing as well, say the work done in partnership with say for instance, with A&L Goodbody, your various corporate law firm partnerships. So your work, say, in the Focus coffee shop, somewhere like that, being where the people are, rather than expecting them to come to you in some ways. There's a massive recognition of the realities of life for a whole lot of people who find themselves in a difficult situation, and training organisations. And indeed, we'll be looking at your 2022 courses for ourselves as well along the way. And then just, I suppose, in some ways, while just to maybe go back to that right to a home, I've always had the view myself that there's no logical reason, there's no legal reason that economic, social and cultural rights aren't all justiciable. There's no particular reason. And therefore I've kind of resisted the right to a home as being singled out when there's so many other areas as well. Having said that, right from Helena's report at the start of it right through, you can see that if you can actually provide people with a right to a secure home, then you can build on their capacity. They can build on their own capacity, because shelter, food and water, they remain the basics without which people really cannot build up or they are in much greater difficulty in building up their other entitlements and rights and their other sense of being a human being with great dignity. And again, though, I am reminded that people without water, food and a home are some of them are amongst the most resilient and most powerful people in our society. But in fact, it beats you down not to have these basics. And there is no reason why one of the richest countries in the world couldn't provide a right to a secure home. So on the basis that Mercy Law Resource Centre is going to continue with its work, it seems to me that it makes clear what access to justice is in our society today, and it works with amongst the most vulnerable and the most impacted. So therefore it improves our whole society, it improves our democracy, it improves the way that we would like to be able to say as a country that we are that we are governed by the rule of law, because we are a bit better as a result of the work. And just again, looking at the annual report, just because I don't think you can ever overestimate the need for investors. But I think to you, to Helena and Aoife, and to the staff of Mercy Law Resource Centre, you've done a magnificent job in 2020. And I know that you could not have done it without the volunteers you have working for you. And I like the way you put it, I might even feel the need to borrow it in the future. The value of our service far exceeds the cost as a result of a large number of in-kind donations you receive. A reduced rented utilities, conference and reception facilities, pro bono legal services by barristers, pro bono expert reports from doctors, engineers, pro bono auditing and account services, and your volunteers and interns. To all of you, I just want to say a huge congratulations. You've done a great job. And I declare your 2020 annual report launched. Thank you.
Thank you, Noeline. Thanks very much for that. It's very inspiring. Look at the rights-based approach to our work, and as I said, sometimes when you're in the day-to-day of the casework, it can be easy to lose the wood for the trees, and it's always important to step back and look at the context and the overall importance of our work and where it fits into, as you say, the legal system and society. So thank you so much for that, Noeline. And I'm going to I should have mentioned at the start that if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the Q&A or in the chat. We have a few minutes left. If anyone does have any questions, just drop them in there and we can answer them. And otherwise, I will hand over to Helena for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Aoife, and let me join Aoife in saying a very big thank you to you, Noeline, for, as Aoife said, your inspiring talk to us, your comprehensive talk to us, your opening up, if you like, of the many pages, not only of the report, but really of the life and the depth in many ways of the Mercy Law Resource Centre. And like any organisation, there are, if you like, depths, to use just that word, that we take for granted, or we don't focus on, or don't just lift the corners to see in the ordinary everyday. So I just really appreciate how you brought out all of the different dimensions there of that are part and parcel of the service, and appreciate your great, if you like, emphasis on the different dimensions of it and how it contributes to the overall work that so many organisations are engaged in trying to make a better world, and in trying to draw attention to the ways in which society, often unconsciously, as well as maybe casually, can just refuse to see or not look at or ignore. And we're in a time when we need to value every single life. We need that for just basic peace and humanity, but we need it especially when we see the cry, when we see the pain, and when we see the injustice that so many people do experience. So we're delighted to have had you with us today, Noeline, and thank you especially for launching our annual report of 2020 today. And we will keep our connections, hopefully, and our paths will cross in many ways, I'm quite sure, along the road as well. So thank you again, Noeline. I also want to thank Aoife for her own very thorough walk through our report today. And thanks to you, Aoife, for lifting up and highlighting various challenges that, you know, are there in the work of Mercy Law, and particularly where relevant in the 2020. I think the mention of the ingenuity of staff in trying to adjust and manage in a way the confines of COVID in order to be able to respond to people who were not only suffering the addition of homelessness, but actually became more pushed to the sidelines by the concentration and the focus of everybody on COVID and its demands. So I thank you as well for lifting out the concern and skill and the action taken by the service during that year, even though you yourself weren't part of it. But I want to thank you for how well you've brought that up to the fore, and also for the way in which in the past year you yourself have become a fully fledged member as managing solicitor of an organisation that you knew from a distance and now know from very immediate experience and involvement. So I want to thank you and to say that your engagement with it and your work over the past year has been exceptional and has followed very much in the pathway that Mercy Law has been set on from the beginning, as Noeline said, to make justice available, to vindicate the right to justice of everybody. And especially it's there because in a society that's affluent, those who have means can easily access justice, but those who don't have means, it becomes a really difficult barrier to get through. So that's the philosophy and the values and the ethos of Mercy Law, to make justice available, especially in the area of housing. So thank you, Aoife, for your input to us today, your overview of the report. And I think we can say that the report, for everybody who's listening, the report will now be on the website today, so that all of those who are listening, you can have access to the report from the website. And it'll be accessible online, in the sense that if you wanted to make a copy, we have not made copies, or have just a few hard copies at the moment, but if anybody wants to get a hard copy, then maybe contact with the office would be the way to go. You certainly can whet your appetite. I think your appetite has been whetted today for the report, so maybe you might try to assuage that a little bit by going into the website and having a read of the report yourself. So thank you very much. I want to also thank the staff, our own staff, who have contributed. Obviously, we would have no service without them. Along with Aoife, we have Paul, Sinead, Catherine, Nuala, Miriam and Heber, all working at present in these COVID times, and with the restrictions that are, curtail our work and curtail our movements, but all of them are working in the full-time capacity. And I want to thank them for their excellence, for their skill, for their contribution, their dedication, and especially, I think, the kindness that characterises the approach, particularly to all those who come with experiencing barriers of one kind or another to finding a home. Also want to thank and to send best wishes to those who left us during this year and in 2020. Rebecca, who is our former managing solicitor, Sister Katrina, Shauna, Danielle, and to thank them for the contribution, and a lot of their work is reflected in the 2020 report. So thank you and blessings on all of them. I also want to thank our board of directors, a very committed, expert and wise board of directors, which reflects the different aspects of competence and skill that's required for a service like Mercy Law. So I think some of them, or a lot of them, are able to be with us on this webinar. So thank you to each of them, and for their contribution and for their commitment to Mercy Law. We're one member of the board is leaving us, that's Patrick, so we wish Patrick well, and thank him for all of the years, something like 12 years that he has been with us. And so I don't know if there's any question you want to answer there, Aoife, or anything.
No, I think that's
Okay.
everything. Well, thanks.
So
Helena.
then let me say a thank you again to Noeline and Aoife and everybody, but especially to everybody who joined in with us and who have been part of this webinar. Thank you. And like my own comment there in the report, last line, I say to all of you who have been with us, please stay with us, because your staying with us enables us to ensure that the service can continue and be available to people who do need that at this time. As I say, it is making good to a promise to those who are in pain. They do need and need to be able to hope for a promise to be fulfilled that society makes to them, that they will get what they are entitled to. And that is keeping that promise in all of us in our own little way, and in particular through Mercy Law Service. We are bringing hope, bringing healing, bringing justice, bringing peace, and bringing well-being, not only to individuals but to society. And as we come to Christmas, in the Christian tradition, it's about making a world where everybody is welcome, everybody is blessed, and everybody has a share in all of the resources that there are, and live a life that is full and happy and dignified. So thank you to everybody once again, and happy Christmas. We probably won't meet, so do enjoy this Christmas, and may 2022 be a happy one for each of you. God bless and thank you.
Thank you, Helena. Thanks, everyone. And I should say there's just one question that's come in, so I might just answer it before we wrap up. And it's I think, an important question in the context of the year, which is how did we as an organisation maintain our well-being and morale during this difficult year? And I suppose I can mainly speak for this year, but I think it's really what we've spoken about today is we just try and make an effort to step back and look at the small wins and the small successes for our individual clients, and focus on where we feel like we are making a difference, and make sure we don't lose heart, and we do keep focusing on the positives and on the good things, because there are always good results for people. So I think that's really how we keep the head up when things are challenging. Well, thank you, Helena, Noeline, and everyone for attending, and we will leave it there.